Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things and welcome to another video. And today, let's talk about Netflix Persuasion. So, back in July, Netflix released a new adaptation of Jane Austen's novel Persuasion. And I know that I'm very, very late to the party, but I finally watched it the other week, so I thought I'd make a video about it because I have some thoughts. As I said, I am very late to the party. I know a lot of people have already watched this and reviewed it very negatively back in July. And I therefore went into it with such very, very, very low expectations that I actually liked it more than I thought I would. I have many thoughts about it, many of which are negative, but are more complicatedly negative than I was expecting them to be, so I thought maybe it would be fun to make a video about it, even though I am very late. And you've probably all seen it already and forgotten about it already. However, I feel like because I'd heard so many terrible things about it, I went into the adaptation like expecting like a 1-star film, and I feel like it was a 3-star film. Like it wasn't a 4 or 5-star film, it wasn't great, and there are many things that bothered me about it, which I'm going to talk about, but I liked it more than I thought I would, and I actually kind of enjoyed it in some ways. I also think that the circumstances I was watching it under helped. I think it probably helped that I watched it quite a long time after it had come out, when I had already heard a lot of bad stuff about it. So I went in with low expectations. But I also watched it like with some friends, fairly casually, like we were chatting over it sometimes. Like we weren't taking it very, very seriously. I feel like if I'd watched it on my own back in July, I would have disliked it much more vehemently. And it's kind of weird that I liked it more than I expected because, one, it does mean that I enjoyed it more, but also it sort of means that I feel more complicatedly and a bit more cross about it because I feel like it could have been good if it had been done differently. Like I feel like I was expecting to watch a film adaptation of Persuasion and to think that everything about it was horrendous and be angry and think that it wasn't salvageable. But I sort of watched it and thought, well, this could have been great, but these things weren't right. And that's kind of sad in a way because I feel like it did actually have quite a lot of potential, but they messed up a lot of things. So let me tell you about the things that I liked about the Netflix Persuasion adaptation, then let me tell you about the things that I didn't like, and the things that made me like specifically really cross. This video will contain some spoilers both for Persuasion the book and also for the film, which is slightly different, quite different. So, you know, if you haven't read Persuasion, maybe don't stick around. First off, I did really like the look of the film. Like, it's really beautifully shot, and also it's very, very stylized in its appearance. So, for example, the character's clothing isn't very historically accurate a lot of the time, but because it was very heavily stylized and like clearly sort of caricatured, I suppose, I kind of didn't mind that too much. I mean, some of Anne's hats were a bit ridiculous, but because it was really stylized, I didn't really mind that too much. I also thought that the minor characters were done really well, specifically the rest of Anne's family, with the exception of Anne, who we'll discuss later. But I thought Sir Walter Elliot, Elizabeth and Mary were all done really, really well, and Mary Musgrove, like, she was absolutely fantastic. She stole the show for me. I loved the interpretation of her. I feel like it felt very true to the book, but also kind of did some fun and interesting things with her. She was hilarious. Like, the thing I found myself laughing at the most throughout the film was Mary as a character, and I thought she was done fantastically, and I really, really liked her presentation. I also felt like Sir Walter Elliot's presentation was really, really good too. And I also found that interesting because I feel like the interpretations of Mary and Sir Walter Elliot were so spot on that it kind of told me that whoever wrote and directed this film did love Jane Austen and does love Persuasion. So I kind of don't understand how it went so wrong around Anne, but you know, more on that later. Another thing that I liked in this Persuasion film was the breaking of the fourth wall. Now, I know that a lot of people didn't like this at all, and I sort of feel that it wasn't right because of the way they did Anne's character, which I'll talk about later. But as like a principle and as a thing, I thought it was good and I thought it was quite effective. I feel like as advice it was really fun, and I feel like it's quite a useful thing to do to get us into the head of the character of Anne, who is quite introverted. Obviously she wasn't very introverted in the film, again, more on that later, but I did like the breaking of the fourth wall and I thought it was a really fun device. Another thing that I quite liked about the Persuasion adaptation, which I think is going to be a very controversial opinion, is that I actually quite liked the modernization of some of the dialogue. I found it very entertaining, and I thought it was fun, and it didn't bother me at all. The discussion of exes, when Anne says that Wentworth has made her a playlist and she's flicking through her sheet music, and that if you're a 5 in London, you're a 10 in Bath. Excellent, hilarious, very, very funny. Even like that really weird bit where Anne starts talking about octopuses for no reason at all. My problem with that was that Anne would never say that, rather than that was a really weird thing to be in the film, because it was, but I found it really funny, so I kind of didn't mind. And I was thinking about why I enjoyed the modern dialogue and why it didn't bother me and why I just found it funny, because I think a lot lot of people didn't find it funny. I think one of the reasons is because I've been to see Ostentatious many times. If you don't know what Ostentatious is, it is the best thing ever. Ostentatious is a group of comic actors who tour the UK putting on improvised Jane Austen novels is the idea. So every time they do a performance, it's completely improvised. They get people from the audience to suggest titles that sound like Jane Austen novels, and then they put on a silly story set in the Regency period, kind of riffing off Jane Austen and the world of Jane Austen, and it is just the funniest thing ever. I love it so much. And Ostentatious do a lot of the kind of juxtaposition between very Regency sounding dialogue with very modern sounding dialogue, and very Regency behaviour with very modern behaviour, and I find it very funny. And I think the fact that I love Ostentatious so much, and the fact that I felt like the new adaptation of Persuasion was kind of in the tone of Ostentatious, that meant that I enjoyed a lot of things about it because I did find it really funny. And those modernised lines in amongst the more Regency dialogue, I found them really entertaining. Leading on from that, the main thing that I really liked about this adaptation of Persuasion is that it was very funny. I found it laugh out loud funny, and I don't mean that I was laughing at how bad it was, which I know some people were. There were some bits which were bad and which made me annoyed. I'll talk about that in a minute, but I genuinely found a lot of it very entertaining. I laughed a lot at the jokes, at the characterisation of Mary and Sir Walter, at a lot of the lines. Like, I did find it a very entertaining, funny film. And yes, Persuasion is the most sombre of Jane Austen's novels, but it does have its really funny moments, and Jane Austen is exceptionally funny as a writer. So I did approve of and appreciate all the humour within this adaptation of Persuasion, and I did find it very funny. I do think that the sense of humour that this Persuasion adaptation had was slightly absurd. You know, that like weird octopus bit. Like, I found that quite funny, but I completely understand why other people don't, because it's quite a weird sense of humour. I have quite a silly, absurdist sense of humour, which I think is partly a slightly British sense of humour, I don't know. So I feel like I found Persuasion quite a lot funnier than some other people do because of my specific sense of humour, which I think is quite a personal thing. So those are the things that I liked about the new film of Persuasion. Let's move on to the things that I didn't like. So the first thing that I think wasn't right about the film was its tone. As I've already said, the humour and the kind of juxtaposition of modern and Regency dialogue kind of reminded me of Ostentatious, and the film was very funny. But that isn't exactly right for Persuasion. Yes, Persuasion has its funny moments, but Persuasion as a book overall is sombre and sad and melancholy, and this film was not. And I feel like the style and tone of this film would have been so much better suited to Northanger Abbey or Pride and Prejudice or Emma, but it just wasn't suited to Persuasion, and it wasn't right for the story. The thing I always look for in a screen adaptation of the book is for the screen adaptation to be faithful to the essence and the spirit of the book. And I don't mind if an adaptation messes around with the plot if it is true to like the feeling of the book. And I feel like this adaptation was not at all true to the feeling of Persuasion. Persuasion is a sombre, serious novel with its comic points, and this was a silly, humorous film with one or two serious points which weren't even that serious. Like, I just feel like it didn't get the tone of Persuasion. Another thing I didn't think was quite right was the characterisation of Louisa Musgrove. I didn't feel that her like spontaneity was established enough, or maybe we just didn't get to see enough of her and spend enough time with her. But that bit where she jumps off the steps at Lyme, I just didn't believe that she would do that. Like, we haven't seen enough of her to believe that she would do that. And to be honest, at that point in the film, it seems much more likely that Anne would do something crazy and wild like that than that Louisa would. We'll talk about Anne in a second, but I feel like the interpretation of Louisa wasn't quite right. She was sweet and confident, but we didn't really get to see that kind of spontaneous side of her. Another thing I felt was wrong was the kind of story of Mr. Elliot and Mrs. Clay. They made it into a kind of love story, and that is not what's going on in the book. Mr. Elliot is not in love with Mrs. Clay. Mr. Elliot wants to tempt Mrs. Clay away from Sir Walter Elliot so that Sir Walter Elliot doesn't remarry, so there isn't an heir between him and inheriting the baronetcy. And I feel like the ending they gave Mr. Elliot and Mrs. Clay, kind of suggesting that they were in love and that was a romantic subplot, I feel like that was just wrong, because that completely changed the characterisation of Mr. Elliot, which I felt was such a shame because the guy playing Mr. Elliot was really great, and I feel like he did such a good job of Mr. Elliot's like cunningness and snideness. I really liked in the film he invites Wentworth to the concert literally just to make him jealous, and then that he talks to Wentworth about his marriage to Anne as though it is a settled thing. I thought all of that felt so true to the character of Mr. Elliot in the book, but then they kind of rushed over the ending to his plotline and made him and Mrs. Clay into a love story rather than a scandal, and I felt that that kind of completely mischaracterised Mr. Elliot as a character. Another thing that I feel like they did wrong, which is quite a big one, but not the biggest one, is the love story between Anne and Wentworth was incorrectly paced. That scene they have on the beach in the film where they're talking about their past and being friends in the future, they come to an understanding far too early. Like, the point in the book is that Anne and Wentworth just like don't talk to each other openly until like the very end, and even then he writes her a letter because they literally can't talk to each other because they're always being pulled apart and there's always other people there, and they're too awkward about it and he's too angry, and they can't actually have a conversation until the very, very, very end. And that's really important, I think, to the book, partly because it's to do with kind of rules and norms of Regency society, but also partly because they don't really have their emotions together enough until the end. Like, in this adaptation, it felt that Wentworth was always in love with Anne all the way through and always knew he was in love with Anne, and that throughout the film we were just kind of waiting for him to get around to telling her so. Whereas in the novel, Wentworth comes back to England and he has told himself that he is not in love with Anne anymore, and he's like purposefully trying to fall in love with Louisa. He ignores her for most of the book, and it's only when they get to Bath that kind of old chemistry sort of rekindles between them. And that was just not the plot arc in the film at all, and I feel like that meant quite a lot of the tension was lost, so I thought that was a shame. I would have liked to see Wentworth be a bit angrier and stiffer and colder with her, as he is supposed to be in the book. But the main thing I didn't like about this new film of Persuasion is the characterisation of Anne, which was just entirely wrong. It was just completely opposite almost from Anne in the book. But also it wasn't consistent. I'm going to link down below the reviews of this film made by my Jane Austen July co-hosts, Claudia from Spitzer's Library and Marissa from Blakely Bookish. Both of them do a really great job of like analysing the character of Anne in the film and exploring why it's not just that her character is inconsistent with Anne in the book, but her character is very inconsistent in itself. In the film, Wentworth says to Anne that he likes that she's great in an emergency, but we just don't see that in the film. That's not the Anne that we're given. That is the Anne we get in the book, but not in the film. Anne in the book is an introvert. She is quiet, she is a listener, she is calm and sensible. She's never self-assertive, but she's very good in an emergency, and she is very kind of emotionally strong, keeps everything bottled up, and she's conscious of social rules and behaves with propriety. That is very much not the Anne that you get in the film. And it annoys me. I don't know at what point as a society we just decided that introverts aren't allowed to have love stories, but that is kind of what it feels like. Why is Anne in the film so melodramatic, so inconsistent? Why does she behave so strangely in a way that doesn't feel consistent with her as a character, but also feels so many, many millions of miles away from Anne in Persuasion? It's such a shame because Anne is such a great, wonderful heroine. She's a fantastically rich character, and I just feel like it was such a shame that they just did her completely wrong. They basically just got rid of Anne Elliot from the novel and put in a new character who wasn't very well characterised herself. And what makes me really sad about this adaptation is that I feel like it could have been really great if Anne as a character had been right. I feel like I would have forgiven the other things that I didn't think were great, and I feel like if Anne as a character had been Anne as in the novel Persuasion, it would have been fantastic. You know, I liked the modern dialogue. I liked Anne talking to the camera, and if Anne talking to the camera had been us seeing inside the head of Anne Elliot from the book, that would have been great. What a great way that would have been to get inside the head of this introverted Jane Austen character. If we had seen Anne behaving in Anne's sensible, calm way to everyone around her, just as she does in Persuasion, and then got to see the sadness and the complicated feelings, and sometimes, yes, the judgment of other people around her in her own head when she talks to the camera, that would have been great. If Anne had behaved to the other people around her as Anne does in the book, then I feel like they could have done what they wanted with her monologue and made it so that Anne is kind of keeping her judgments of other people, which she has to herself, behaving respectfully and quietly and meekly to everyone around her, but actually having this big inner life, which she kind of does. Like, I feel like that would have been so good, and I feel like it would have been a great way to look inside the head of this introverted Jane Austen heroine, but they just didn't do that, and I don't really know why. You know, there is so much in the novel Persuasion about suppressed emotion, and if we could have seen the juxtaposition between Anne talking to the camera, admitting her emotions, and Anne talking to everyone else not, that would have been great. But instead, they made Anne into a person who is so many millions of miles away from who Anne in the book is. I can just about believe that Anne Elliot might put jam on her face to entertain children, because Anne Elliot is supposed to be good with her sister's kids, but there is no version of Anne Elliot that bears any resemblance to the Anne Elliot that Jane Austen wrote, who would ever get drunk at a party and declare that Charles Musgrove wanted to marry her first. She would just never, ever, ever say that, and I feel like that bit of the whole film was like my least favourite, because Anne would just never, ever, ever say that. She just wouldn't. She just wouldn't say that, and it just really, really bugged me, much more than that weird octopus thing. It bothered me that she said that at the dinner party about Charles Musgrove, because she wouldn't, and it wasn't even necessary. Like, we found it out again from Louisa and Wentworth talking a few scenes later. The same with that bit where she shouts Wentworth's name through the window. Like, Anne would never ever do that. And I didn't mind the bits where she was talking to the camera because I felt it could be believable that Anne might think all these things but not say them. But it was when she acted and said things that felt so out of character from Anne in the book that just made me really sad. The way Anne is characterised throughout the film, it seems much more likely that she, not Louisa, will be the one to jump spontaneously off the steps at Lyme, because she is the spontaneous one. She is the one who behaves without thinking. She is the one who is irrational, not Louisa. And that is like the whole like turning point of Persuasion. And they just messed it up because Anne's character and Louisa's character weren't right. And it just made me cross, because I feel like there were so many good, interesting elements, and I liked the modern dialogue, and I liked the talking to the camera, and I thought it looked great, and some of the minor characters were done so well, but Anne was just so wrong that it wasn't Persuasion. This has been a long, rambly, ranty video. Please do let me know down in the comments if you have seen the adaptation of Persuasion. What did you think of it? And that's all for now. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.